Well, hello everybody in Great Books Lit 203. Steve Kirkhoff coming at you. I wanted to provide some thoughts because we won't be able to speak with each other much about the end of Persuasion. And it's such a beautiful book that's sad that I had to be away. Here I am away, and I wanted to just touch base with you about I guess, the entire second half of Persuasion. I'll try to keep this brief. I think where we left off, the party of the Musgroves and Captains Harville and Bennick, Wentworth, and we're all in line. And this is the turning point of the novel. This is precisely the midpoint. And we've seen our heroine, Anne, basically living a death in life. She's dead while she's alive. And that's metaphorical, but it's also psychological and emotional. She lost her mother when she was a teenage girl, and who knows, the kinds of grief that she feels and the mourning that she's gone through is complicated because she lives in a family which is narcissistic and incapable of properly mourning the loss of the mother. And it seems like Anne is the scapegoat of the family. Scapegoats are often the most gifted in the family and the ones who can withstand the recriminations, envy, spite, hatred of the family members who turn on the indicated person who bears the suffering of the family. And that's Anne. She's quietly going about it. This is a very quiet book. You know, Jane Austen is known for her sardonic attitude toward the British aristocracy and her wit, like her tongue, her gift for language. And it's interesting that her protagonist is so quiet. It's a book of quietness. It's really kind of a book about silence. It's a book about the inner space of the human being, where all the real battles are fought in real life, not even so much in literature. It's true, it's real. That's where the battles of life are fought. And we're basically seeing, in a way, we're seeing Jane Austen herself, it seems, through the character of Anne. She seems the clearest because she's the most complex. So she might be the clearest reflection that we could get of Jane Austen. She had no voice, it says in chapter 6. Anne had no voice. Well, who has no voice? The dead. And she's spiritually and emotionally dead. And it's compounded between her mother's grief and the loss of Wentworth, a loss after a loss. And so it's a book about loss, and it's a book about recovery. And it all starts at Lyme. It's gotten progressively better. We remove from Kellynch Hall to Upper Cross, and things get a little better. There's the boisterous family. Anne still is not a dramatic, dynamic personality there. She's overlooked there. But when we go to Lyme, it's the first time and the only time, I don't remember what chapter it is. Maybe it's chapter 10 or 11. When they go to Lyme, Jane Austen describes the countryside. She's starting to open her eyes and see what's around her. The artificiality of Kellynch Hall has been progressively stripped away until she comes face to face with the ocean. She goes to the sea, and the sea, the mar, as in ma, as in mother. She goes to the sea, the mother of us all, the place of origination, the deeply mysterious and inhospitable at the same time. You know, the mother of the sea is a tough place for a human body to be, and yet we did come out of there. That's where all life on earth came from the sea. And she goes to the seaside and she starts to recover her bloom. And she's noticed by Mr. Elliot, and he becomes, of course, the sort of the dark figure that she has to exorcise from her personality by the end of the book. She has to cast off Mr. Elliot because he would be a false sense of security for her. He would be duplicitous. He would be a horrible match for her. And yet there's something about you find the kind of person that you're capable of being with. You find the kind of person in life who reflects who you are and where you are at the moment. You go for what you think you're worth getting in terms of romance. And so he's a temptation for her while she's rebounding, while she's getting her life together again. She's still unfirm. She's still not quite wholly put together. But her rise comes with Louisa's fall. And when Louisa falls from the cob, Anne jumps into the situation and handles it with a very cool head. And she's basically treating the younger self that she was. Um, and she starts to understand also in her conversations with Captain Bennick that he can rally again, she says, when she's thinking about Captain Bennick, who lost his fiancée, who was Captain Harville's sister. He will rally again, she says, and she's starting to have this little voice inside herself is starting to grow, that perhaps I too can heal, perhaps I too can come together. And when that girl Louisa falls, jumping for Wentworth, there's something wonderfully sort of parallel about Louisa's fall and Anne's rise, Anne's resurrection. She ministers to Louisa, she attends to her, and it's in a way attending to herself. Anyway, then after we go from Lyme to Bath, and that's where our novel finishes. So the stage is set in Bath because Louisa falls in love with Captain Bennick while he's tending to her from her fall and her recovery. And that means that Wentworth is off the hook with Louisa. Their dalliance is now over. Wentworth is free. He's not in Bath, but he comes. And this leaves Anne in Bath with her family. And even though she's on the mend, she's not quite the person she needs to be, the healthy person that she wants to be. She has to get over another horrible fear. Sometimes our fears attract us. And she has a friend that she knew from her school days in Bath, Mrs. Smith, who's a widow and poor and destitute and lonely and isolated. She has a crappy apartment in a bad part of Bath. And it becomes a matter of friction between Anne and Sir Walter because Anne decides to not see the Dalrymples and instead visits her friend Mrs. Smith. And Anne likes Mrs. Smith because Mrs. Smith is witty. She has her wits about her, even though she's suffering from an illness. This is the darkest fear of a Jane Austen. This is the darkest fear of a woman in Regent era England, to be alone, isolated in the world, taking in sewing and knitting and trying to make a living, scratch out a living from your handiwork, like she does needlepoint or something like that. And she's alone and she's sickly. This is the darkest fear of Jane Austen. This is the darkest fear of her character, Anne Elliot. What will become of me if I do not find a man? This is what will become of me, Mrs. Smith. So Anne has to confront that dark fear, and she has to find out what that dark fear is communicating to her, because our fears are telling us things, and we have to be able to withstand the onslaught of the emotion of fear to understand what it's about. And I think that's kind of what Anne has to do. If she was motivated by her fear, she would link up with Mr. Elliot, and that would be disastrous. If she was able to transcend her fear and to incorporate the message that it's trying to bring to her, what is it saying to her? So much of this book is about talking, it's about speech, it's about the inner speech in our minds, it's about the speech that talks to us when we're alone and when we're quiet. And that's what Mrs. Smith is. She's this sort of damaged female, the fear that is in Anne's unconscious mind, and she speaks to Anne and she tells Anne the truth of Mr. Elliot. So her fear actually is working to her benefit here. through Mrs. Smith, through her fear, she understands that Mr. Elliot would not be the solution, that a fearful run into the arms of Mr. Elliot, a panicky reaction to her loneliness, would not land her in the right place. She has to be able to live with the fact that she might be single and that she's not going to make a bad choice just out of the fear of isolation and loneliness and destitution. She's not going to choose her life path as a reaction to fear. She's going to understand that, and she's going to be able to be okay with herself without needing to run to a man. So Mrs. Smith communicates to her. It's like the unconscious side of her personality is telling her, because she's patient and she's not, panic stricken. So anyway, the whole novel comes down to chapter 23, the beautiful resurrection, the total resurrection of love, the resurrection of her damaged self into a healed self. When they're at a sitting room somewhere in Bath, there are a few people there, including Captain Harville, with whom Anne is speaking at a window, and then not far off, a few feet away, at a writing desk, is Captain Wentworth writing a letter at Captain Harville's request, because Wentworth is good at that stuff. So it turns out that Captain Harville is a little upset that Captain Benwick recovered so quickly from the distraught feelings of the loss of Captain Harville's sister, Benwick's betrothed, his fiancée. Now he's engaged to be married with Louisa, and this makes Captain Harville upset. How could he have forgotten my sister so quickly? And at this particular moment, Anne is ready with a response. She has her voice. She will speak. And when she speaks, Wentworth is listening just a few feet away. And she's actually bringing Wentworth to his self through her speech. She moves him so that he can get through his anger, get through his stubbornness, get through his jealousy, get through his whatever he felt as a spurned lover of Anne, and truly embrace her again. This is the most literary form of falling in love you can imagine. Here's Jane Austen writing her love scene, and the scene consists of this. A woman who has been speechless for most of the novel is speaking on the subject of love to a man, and her lover a few feet away is listening. And while he's writing a letter, so there's speech and writing and language, how all this mediates love. He's writing a letter. He stops writing the letter that he was intending to write for Captain Harville's sake, and he starts writing to Anne when he hears her saying these things. Her speech is like a musical instrument that charms Wentworth and herself to such an extent that they fall in love again. It's through Anne's action. Anne becomes like a sort of female Orpheus. If you remember the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, Orpheus was the gifted musician in Greek legend who lost his wife or betrothed on the day of their wedding. She was bitten by a snake and she died, and she was taken to Hades. And Orpheus is such a gifted musician that when he plays his lyre, he is able to tame wild animals, to make the gods stop what they're doing. Clocks stop, time stops. Everybody listens to this beautiful harmony of music. Anne is doing the same thing. So she's kind of a female Orpheus. And she speaks on the subject of love. And Wentworth, hearing her speech, immediately begins writing her a letter, responding to her what she's saying in the moment. And what is it that Anne says? She says that women love longer than men. Yes, we certainly do not forget you as soon as you forget us. It is perhaps our fate rather than our merit. We cannot help ourselves. We live at home, quiet, confined, and our feelings prey upon us. How truthful she's being. You are forced on exertion. You have always a profession, pursuits, business of some sort or other, to take you back into the world immediately, and continual occupation and change soon weaken impressions. Men are out in the world and they forget. Granting your assertion that the world does all this so soon for men, which, however, I do not think I shall grant, it does not apply to Benwick. So this is Harville retorting. He had not been forced upon any exertion. The peace turned him on shore at the very moment, and he has been living with us in our little family circle ever since. True, said Anne. Very true. I did not recollect, but what shall we say now, Captain Harville? If the change be not from outward circumstances, it must be from within. It must be nature, man's nature, which has done the business for Captain Benwick. No, no, it's not man's nature. I will not allow it to be more man's nature than woman's to be inconstant and forget those they love or have loved. I believe the reverse. I believe in a true analogy between our bodily frames and our mental, and that as our bodies are the strongest, so are our feelings, capable of bearing most rough usage and ridding out the heaviest weather. So it's a beautiful notion, right? Men have robust physical frames, and so we can handle rough usage in the emotional life as well. But Anne has a comeback. Your feelings may be the strongest, replied Anne, but the same spirit of analogy will authorize me to assert that ours are the most tender. Man is more robust than woman, but he is not longer lived, which exactly explains my view of the nature of their attachments. Nay, it would be too hard upon you if it were otherwise. You have difficulties and privations and dangers enough to struggle with. You are always laboring and toiling, exposed to every risk and hardship, your home, country, friends, all quitted, neither time nor health nor life to be called your own. It would be hard indeed, with a faltering voice, if women's feelings were to be added to all this. We shall never agree upon this question, Captain Harville was beginning to say, when a slight noise called their attention to Captain Wentworth's hitherto perfectly quiet division of the room. It was nothing more than that his pen had fallen down, but Anne was startled at finding him nearer than she had supposed, and half inclined to suspect that the pen had fallen because he had been occupied by them, striving to catch sounds, which yet she did not think he could have caught. But of course he did catch it. He did hear what she said, and he is so moved by it because these are his feelings exactly, that he had been long suffering in love, that he had loved Anne more than she had loved him, etc., etc. So this book is so much a question of being able to tolerate powerful internal feelings, sensations, emotional states that knock you down in life. And if you can practice at it, you can get better at it. And I think that's what Anne has been doing this entire novel long, is she's been practicing at managing her inner life and making herself capable as a human of true love. And in his own way, so has Captain Wentworth. They do it differently because they're different persons, but they're striving for the same thing. And that's what makes their love great, because they both want this kind of love, which is pure, which is not based on need, but it's based upon the desire to be a complete human being, and in the presence of another human being who's also willing to be exposed to the hazards of the internal life, you can really forge a powerful and nourishing relationship. It's a beautiful thing. That's all I wanted to say. Maybe we'll talk more about it on our return. I'll see you Monday, October 10th.